Hey, hi there, how's it going? Whiskey is a wonderful drink, and I've been enjoying whiskey for years, but I didn't really start to explore and get more out of whiskey until I started attending whiskey tastings. And when I first started going, I didn't know the first thing, and I got taken through the process, and it really opened up a whole new world of being able to enjoy the whiskey that I was drinking. Now, you can still drink whiskey however works for you, whether that's neat, on the rocks, mixed, or even in whiskey-based cocktails. If you've been invited to a whiskey tasting, or you want to impress a whiskey-loving friend, or even if you just want to explore more and get more out of your whiskey experience, there is a process to whiskey tastings, and it's not that hard. So if we cover off the basics, it'll help you get started and have the confidence to perhaps join a whiskey tasting club. Now, the point of a whiskey tasting is to focus on the whiskey itself. That means there's not going to be any ice, there's no mixers, you're drinking the whiskey neat. And you're going to be drinking it in a whiskey tasting glass. There's a lot of different whiskey tasting glasses out there, the most common of which is the trusty Glencairn, but they're all shaped in a very similar way, kind of like a wine glass, in that you've got a slightly wider bowl to allow the whiskey itself to open up, and then it tapers to the surface to bring the aromas to the nose to allow you to nose the whiskey. Which brings me to the 4 stages of whiskey tasting, which is appearance, nose, palate, and finish. So just so that I've got something on hand while I'm talking to you through this, I'm drinking a glass of Glenlivet Founders Reserve. This is a really good entry-level whiskey from the Glenlivet distillery, one of the older ones in Scotland. Now, the first stage is appearance. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the whiskey in the glass, and you've got colour, clarity, and viscosity. Now, the colour can be anything from a light straw to a gold, amber, even deep dark reds. The clarity is how clear the whiskey is. So whether it's clear or cloudy. And then the viscosity, the way you test this is you swirl the whiskey around in the glass and you pay attention to how the whiskey is draining back down. What you're forming here is these whiskey legs. Now, if they're thick, that means it's a very thick, oily sort of whiskey. But if the legs are very thin and drain quickly, this is an indication that it's chill filtered and may have a softer, medium-bodied flavour. Unfortunately, you still don't get to drink the whiskey yet. The next stage is the nose. Now, when you're nosing a whiskey, I find the best bet is to put your nose close to the opening and breathe in through both your mouth and your nose. With whiskies that are higher ABV, higher alcohol volume, if you take a deep breath straight through your nose, you're going to burn your nostrils. So that's why we put our nose close to the opening, open your mouth and breathe in through both. And that's where you start to pick up those notes, those scents. And they fall into 8 kind of categories. You don't need to remember them all. So the grainy scents are sort of like that cereal and malt. Fruity can be anything from fresh to citrus sort of fruit smells, dried fruit, even cooked. Floral comes across as fragrant, solvent or grassy. Peat is that smoky, almost medicinal iodine or salty. Fainty is anything from toasted biscuits to tobacco, honey and leather. Sulfuric comes across as cabbage, matches, rubber or even sandy sort of smells. Woody is vanilla, spicy, cinnamon and those sorts of notes. Winey is nutty, oily and sometimes even chocolate. So the nose on this whiskey, this sort of falls more into the fruity, woody and winey categories. So I'm getting there's sort of like a faint toffee in the background, a bit of zesty citrus and sort of some honeyed cinnamon. So now you can take a sip of the whiskey. So take a sip, swirl it around the mouth, taste it a little bit, and try to take note of what flavors are coming through. Now, taste is subjective, so everyone's going to get a slightly different profile. But the categories of these sort of flavors that you're going to pick out, they fall into those same 8 categories that we do on the nosing. Now, quite often with whiskey, the nose and the palate can be quite different. So you'll get one flavor profile when you're just smelling the whiskey and you get a completely different one on the palate. With the Founders Reserve, what I'm getting on the palate is pretty much a continuation of what we got on the nose. So again, we're still getting more of that zesty sort of citrus sort of note. Those toffee flavors are still coming through, and that cinnamon is sort of coming through probably a little bit less on the honey side and more on an earthy sort of side. But you see what I mean, that those flavor profile from the nose to the palate is very much similar. The last of the 4 stages of whiskey tasting is the finish. And that's simply paying attention to the flavors that are still remaining on your palate once you've finished the glass. Sometimes you can have a very short finish where those flavors dissipate quickly, and sometimes you can have a really, really long finish where those flavors just remain on the palate. They just sort of, they stay there in the back of your mouth, or they may even progress and change. Now, with this whiskey, more of the earthy sort of flavors dissipate rather quickly, but that sort of honey and that little bit of zesty sweetness, that remains on the palate around the sides of your mouth for a while afterwards. And that's what we mean by the finish. What remains after you finish drinking the whiskey, and whether it dissipates quickly or lasts and lingers. So that's the 4 stages of tasting the whiskey. Now there is an optional extra that sometimes people do. This isn't essential, but the simple act of adding a drop or 2 of water to a neat whiskey can actually open up some of the flavors, and it can take away some of the harshness, which allows you to pick up some of the flavors that you may not have noticed the first time around. And that's just a simple matter of adding 1 or 2 drops to your glass and then going through those 4 stages again. So looking at the appearance, the nose, the palate, and the finish. Now with this whiskey, as you can see, it hasn't really changed the appearance at all. It's still the same color. The main thing that it tends to change is the clarity in the legs. So the clarity here is still the same. Sometimes adding water will make the whiskey a little bit cloudier, and the legs are dissipating about the same rate. So there's no change there. On the nose, it's softened some of those bitter elements that were very subtle in the background, but because it's softened those, it's allowed some more of the fruity sweetness to come across to the surface. On the palate, again, with that bitterness gone, it allows some of those softer flavors to come through. And so that sweetness has actually progressed, and it's become a little bit more like, almost like an apple turnover. So it's like that cooked apple sort of flavor. And then the finish, if you think about the flavors that are remaining in the mouth, it hasn't really changed how long they linger in the mouth, but again, it's softened them. You don't have quite that sweet sharpness, and sort of it allows you to sort of get more of that cinnamon sort of note, and like I said, that apple turnover sort of flavor. So that's it, that's the basics. That's all you need to know to get started. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and Slange.